sempre no.
Hey everybody, it's Edie and welcome to Mixed Mediology. Today's video is an episode of This Witch's Kitchen. Woo! So on today's video, I want to share my recipe for the best bread ever. I can't even tell you how many different bread recipes I've made. I've tried whole wheat bread recipes, I've tried all-purpose bread recipes, bread flour recipes, the combination of the three. If there's a bread recipe on Pinterest, I might have tried it. Because I have been searching for years for the perfect bread. And to me, the perfect bread is a bread that you can just pull out of the oven, slather some bread on, or slather some butter on, and just eat as it is. It's also good with things, you know, to go with dinner, but it's sandwich bread. Like it's not so dense or so thick or so heavy tasting that it takes away from a sandwich, even a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So that's the bread that I was searching for. Basically like the bread that you go buy at the store, but homemade. That's what I was searching for. And I can't even tell you how many different bread recipes I tried and how many bread recipes I fucked up in an attempt to find the perfect bread. So about, I don't know, 2.5, maybe 3 years ago, I found this recipe on Pinterest, and it was different because the person who had originally posted the recipe walked through things that I had never even taken into account when making bread. Every other time I made bread, I put in a certain number, you know, like I measured my ingredients, I put them into the fucking bowl, mixed it up, put it in the pan, and baked it for a certain number of minutes, and that was it. But there are nuances to bread that I had never even considered before. Now, my grandma could make some awesome fucking bread. She could make biscuits, and she made everything from scratch. She made pie crust, she made everything from scratch. And she always tried to teach me, and I never listened, and God, I wish I had listened. But by the time I was ready to listen and start doing these things on my own, she had passed away, so it wasn't like I had someone that I could just go to and say, hey, how do you make bread and how do you make it so good? So, trial and error, finally stumbled upon this recipe, and like there were nuances that I had never even considered. Like, you don't just mix up some fucking ingredients and bake it for a certain number of minutes and come out with great bread. It doesn't work that way. So, I tried the recipe and it is perfect. It is the perfect bread for everything. Seriously, dude, you can make a fucking peanut butter and jelly sandwich on this and it's just sandwich bread. It's so perfect. It's so light and fluffy and the taste is good and like it's just the perfect bread. I don't even know how, look at how gorgeous. Look at the gorgeousness of this bread. And I love bread. I eat bread all the time, like every single day. I feel like I'm that fucking Oprah commercial. If you have, I think it's Apple TV. We have several different things here in Italy. I think it's Apple TV. If you've seen it, I hate this fucking commercial, but it's Oprah and she's just like shouting from the rooftops that she loves bread and she's saving the world by eating fucking bread every single day. And I hate that fucking commercial, but in reality, I eat bread every single fucking day and I love bread. Anyway. So this bread is perfect. So I'm going to walk you step by step through the entire process. I have tweaked the recipe slightly from the original version. So what I will do is link you to the original website that I found the recipe on, but then I'll make little notes in the description below about any changes that I've made so that you can see the text. You know, you don't have to go through and watch the video every single time. But you'll see little notes that I've made in the description box of this video compared to the original website. So the website that I originally found this recipe on is Delia Creates, and that's the link you'll find below. However, I have tweaked the recipe enough that I feel like I can call it my own and share what I do here with you. I think she uses white whole wheat flour and regular flour. I use only bread flour, I do a little bit differently whenever I put it in to rise and things like that. So you'll get to see the full making of this bread, but I kind of want to tell you a few things ahead of time so that when you start watching the recipe and you want to make it yourself, things will make more sense. So when you first start adding all of your ingredients to the bowl, you want to use really hot tap water. Yeast needs to proof, and so there's like this magical perfect temperature that yeast needs to be at in order to become active. And if it's too hot, you'll kill the yeast, and if it's too cold, it won't activate. So like there's this happy medium mystery temperature that you have to find with yeast. The way I find my temperature is I just turn my water all the way to hot, turn it all the way up so that it comes in and it's steaming, like it's steaming in the sink. And that's the temperature water that I use. Now my fucking water is really hot. We like really hot water here, so I have mine probably turned up higher than a lot of people. My water gets super hot and it will scald the shit out of you. But I use that water to start with because you're mixing other ingredients in, which is kind of tempering the temperature and bringing it where it needs to be. You know, there's 30 seconds here, 30 seconds there. You're adding in either room temperature or cool ingredients, because flour, even though it's room temperature, feels cool to the touch. So you're adding in these other ingredients that kind of temper the heat and bring it where it needs to be to activate the yeast and not kill it. So that's tip number one. I use super hot tap water. I don't boil my water. I have no fucking idea what temperature it is, but it's really hot. And then, you know, you're whisking for little bits at a time. The recipe calls for 3/4 of a cup of flour when you first start. Like that's one of your very first ingredients that you put into the bowl. That is not counted when you're figuring out how much flour to put into your bread. So that 3/4 cup, it goes in there no matter what. Then you add an additional 7 cups on top of that. So whenever you're calculating how much flour you've put in, just kind of forget about that original 3/4 cup. So you mix in your ingredients, and I knead it in the bowl for just a little bit, and mine's really sticky. I think in the original recipe she talks about getting it to be shaggy. I don't take it quite to shaggy. I put in my original ingredients, and then I do 3 cups of flour, and I use only bread flour. And I mix that in the bowl, and then I add an additional 2 cups, which gets me to 5 cups total, not counting that original 3/4 cup. And wherever that brings me, that's kind of where I stop. And it's usually still pretty sticky. I add a little bit of flour just into the bowl to kind of help me get it out, but I leave it where it is. And it's not necessarily shaggy, but it's starting to get to that point when I take mine out. Then you knead it for a full, I set a timer for a full 7 minutes. She recommends 5 to 7 or 5 to 8 minutes or something like that. I set my timer, I do 7 minutes, and I use 2 cups of flour. I don't go over that 2 cups of flour because I've done it before, just adding flour and adding flour. I think I had miscalculated the moisture, or maybe it was a really humid day or something. I don't know. Anyway, I kept adding more flour, and then the bread was still good and it was still light, but I could tell that it was heavier than normal. So now I'm very careful about only using 7 cups of flour max. So I use 2 cups when I'm actually kneading the bread, and I knead it for a full 7 minutes using no more than 2 cups of flour. So then you put it in the oven and you let it rise. I do a slightly different technique for the rising of my bread. I think on the original recipe, Delia suggests turning your oven on and then letting it get warm for just a couple minutes and then turning it back off. I don't do that. I use a cold oven. I set a pot of water, and I use a medium-sized pot. I'm too far away from it, but my pot's probably about this big around and this deep, so I don't know, like a couple quarts, maybe a 2-quart pot. I fill it up, put it on, and bring it to a boil while I'm mixing up my bread and kneading it. When I'm letting my dough rise for the first time, I stick it in the cold oven with the pot fresh off the stove and boiling, and put it in the oven, and I close the door and I leave it closed. I cover it with a tea towel and I don't open the oven for 30 minutes. And then I go back, I check it, I see if it's risen to where it needs to be, and if it has, then I pull it out and go to the next step. If it's not, I reboil my water, stick it back in the oven, and give it another 30 minutes. There are tips on Delia's website, and she basically says these are the nuances that I never considered when making bread. So like when you're letting it rise that first time, it's more important that it doubles in size than to go by a set number of minutes. So yeah, you can start with the timer and use that as a gauge, but your real determining factor should be that it's doubled in size. So if you've gotten to 30 minutes and your dough is, you know, starting to rise but it's not huge, leave it the fuck alone. Let it do what it's gonna do. Like yeast needs time to develop and it needs time to rise and expand. Let it do its thing. Don't fuck with it. Just leave it alone. The same thing when you go for the second rise. You'll see in the video, you pull it out, you break it into 3 sections, you roll it out, and then you put it in your bread pans and stick it back in the oven. I do the same exact technique with the hot boiling water in the cold oven. By this time it's fairly warm because I've kept moist water in there. And the moist water helps to retain moisture in your bread, and it keeps it nice and warm, and it gives that yeast the perfect moist warm environment to grow. So you split it into 3 parts, you let it rise again in the bread pan, and you want it to fill the pan. So again, you start with 30 minutes, you come back and check it, and if it's not, I like it to go up over the top of my pan. You can see that my dough has come over the top of my pan. It doesn't rise more as it's baking, so you need to let it rise as much as it will before you start baking. Again, it's more important that it rises and fills your pan than 30 minutes on the clock. So yeah, make sure you let it rise. Just let it do its thing. Bread is a labor of love. You can't rush it. Like, you just gotta leave it alone and let it do its thing. So then you bake it for 30 minutes. At the end of that 30 minutes, you come back and you test it. And there's a specific test that you need to do in order to determine if your bread is done. So yes, 30 minutes is your guide, but that does not necessarily mean that it's done. Bread is a labor of love, and there are nuances to it. So one of the way, or the best way to check and see if your bread is done is to give it the thump test. And you can thump it with a finger, like so. I like to use the back of a spoon. And you hear how that sounds? Like, it sounds very light, but it sounds hollow. It doesn't sound dense, it doesn't sound thick, it doesn't sound wet, it doesn't sound heavy or like it's not done. It's very light and very hollow. And you want to check all 3 of your loaves. Now, my oven gets hotter on one side than the other. So what I tend to do is I have 3 different size bread pans. You'll see in the video. I have 3 different size bread pans. Actually, 2 of them are the same size, but they're different color. But this one is significantly smaller than the other 2, and it's silicone. So the bottom of this loaf of bread always gets brown faster, and it cooks faster. So I put this on the coldest side of my oven, and this is always the first loaf that I test and pull it out if it's done. And then if it's done, I pull it out. If it's not done, I pull out the ones that are done and leave the rest in the oven. And I test every single one of them with the thump test and to see if they're done. So I think that's it. I'm gonna show you the full making of. So I'm gonna do everything that I do and show you the full baking process. So come on down to the counter and let's bake some bread. Alright, I have everything that I need already laid out right here in front of me, because these first few steps you have to work kind of quickly. So you want everything within reach so that you don't have to go hunt it down or shuffle through a drawer or walk across the kitchen, because you have to work kind of quickly in this first few steps. So it's better to just have everything right at your fingertips when you get started. Speaking of fingertips, you'll notice that I'm not wearing any of my rings or jewelry. That's because I'm actually going to be kneading the bread here in the bowl and then on the counter, and I can't stand getting bread dough and stuff, or any kind of dough in my rings as I'm cooking. So I take everything off before I start. The first thing you're going to need is 2 cups of really hot water. I don't know if you can see it, but the hot water comes out of my tap and it's steaming. So I just use hot tap water, only because my tap water comes out really hot to begin with. Now we're going to add 1/3 cup of olive oil. And I fill it right to the top, but don't let it overflow. And 1/3 cup of honey. And I'm going to fill this off to the side so I can squeeze it better. There we go. Again, you want to fill it right to the top, but don't let it overflow. And if you do the olive oil first, the honey just slides right out. Next, you're going to add 1 tablespoon of salt. So I scoop into my salt and then use a knife blade to go across the top to make sure it's nice and even. And then you whisk it together. You just want to kind of incorporate everything together right now. And just scrape that salt up from the bottom, scrape the honey up from the bottom. Now we want to add 3/4 cup of bread flour. And I like to scoop it in. And actually I use a whisk when I'm getting to the regular adding of the flour. This first 3/4 cup I don't really worry about, but I do scrape off the top so that I get the right measurement. But in all of the other bread flour that I add, I use a sifter, not a whisk, a sifter to aerate the flour and get it nice and light and fluffy. So you just want to whisk this for about 30 seconds or so, just to kind of get it incorporated and make sure there's no clumps. Now we want to add 1.5 tablespoons of yeast. And so I just use my tablespoon and then I kind of eyeball the half. That looks about right. And then you want to whisk that in for another 30 seconds or so just to incorporate it. Make sure you get it all off the top and push down into your liquid ingredient and scrape the bottom. Now you want to add 3 cups of sifted flour to your liquid mixture, and the way I do this is I just put my measuring cup down in the bottom. I have my sifter. I use another scoop to put my flour into my sifter and sift it into my measuring cup. Add more if needed. And this is harder to do on camera than normal. Normally I breeze right through this. But I'm working behind the camera so that you get a good angle. So, I've sifted my flour into my measuring cup and then I use the back of a knife to just scrape it off so that I get a nice even measure. And I whisk in each cup at a time. Just a little bit, just so that each ingredient is getting incorporated equally. Because if you put a big clump of flour in here, it's more likely to clump, literally. It's just harder to incorporate as you go along. So I do each cup at a time and give it a little whisk. Maybe if I switch these, switch sides, it'll be better. Let's see how that goes. Much better, much better. Oops. And I'm working a little bit slower than normal because, like I said, I have the camera right in front of me, so it's a little bit harder to do than normal. So I hope this bread turns out, because I am taking significantly longer than normal to do this. And you'll notice that I'm doing a little bit of flour at a time and then adding more flour. That's because my sifter will get clogged up if I put too much flour in here to begin with. And I don't want that, because then again, that makes you take longer putting the flour into your wet ingredients. So if you need to work in smaller bits of flour in the sifter at a time, do that. If you notice that your sifter is clogging up, that's probably the reason. Just use less flour at a time. All right. There we go. Now it's starting to come together. And that's what you want. At this point, it's probably safe to switch to a wooden spoon because it's starting to thicken up. So you want to add 2 more cups of sifted flour. There's 1. Now, as you're making this, you want to, if you're like me and you want to put an intention into your bread or do some spell work here, then you want to stir clockwise. And as you're stirring, you want to be putting your intention or your spell into your bread as you go. So if you have specific words that you want to say or energy that you want to put into the bread, now is the time to do that to get it started, and then you can do it again when you start to knead the bread. There we go, that's the 2nd cup. So I did my first 3/4 of a cup just to get a little bit of a base in there. And then I did 3 cups of sifted flour that I whisked in. And then 2 cups of flour that I'm now using my wooden spoon to incorporate. You can see it's really starting to thicken up now. So it's 5 cups of flour, bread flour, plus the 3/4 cup that you used in the beginning. When you're doing your measurements for your amount of flour, you don't take into consideration that 3/4 of a cup. And that'll make more sense when you see the recipe written out later at the end. Alright, so my dough is still fairly sticky, but that's okay because I like to use a lot of flour as I'm kneading. So I'm alright with it being a little sticky right now. So I'm just going to knead the dough in the bowl here for a little bit just to kind of incorporate everything really well. And if it's a little too sticky, you can add a little bit of flour, but you want to just keep track of how much flour you're adding. So the way I work is I'll fill my measuring cup with flour, and then I'll pour it into my sifter, little bits at a time, and I'd never use more than 2 additional cups of flour for kneading. And so I know if I fill my cup more than twice, then I've got a problem. Alright, so my dough is still kind of sticky, but you can see it's starting to get that shredded look. It's starting to look shaggy. I couldn't think of the word. It's starting to look shaggy. So I'm going to turn my dough out onto a floured countertop. So I have my sifter here, and I'm going to dump in a cup of flour. And I just probably put too much flour in here. It's going to clog it up. Maybe not. Okay. I'm going to pull my dough out of the bowl, put it right into this flour. And now I'm going to start kneading. Oh, it's clogging up. I knew it. I'm just going to start kneading my dough. And I set a timer for 7 minutes because you want to knead the dough for at least 7 minutes. 8's even better. I try to go for at least 7. So I set my timer and then I start kneading my bread. And if you've never kneaded bread before, it's actually quite therapeutic. Like, you could seriously get your frustrations out by kneading some bread. And again, if you're putting an intention or a spell into this, you want to be thinking about that and putting that energy into your dough the whole time you're kneading it. And you just want to keep working the flour into your dough, and you can see it's already much less sticky than when I flipped it out onto the counter. But as I work the flour in, if you've never kneaded dough before, it gradually gets more and more sticky again as you're kneading the flour in because it's getting absorbed by the wet ingredients. So you'll just add more flour underneath if you need to. And just keep kneading until you've used up that 2 cups of flour and reached 7 minutes. Every time your flour gets sticky, just add a little bit more flour as long as you don't go over that additional 2 cups. So I'm about halfway through my kneading process. I've got 3 minutes left. You can see my dough is very much more solid than it was when I first started out. I'm having to add less flour less frequently, and it's really starting to come together in a nice elasticy dough. So I just want to keep going the full 7 minutes with 7 total cups of flour. And I know some of you may have, arthritis or fibro or something that doesn't really allow you to use your fingers. You can use your fists and just knead gently if you need to. Or get somebody to come in there and knead it for you. Because it's actually really fun and it's a good workout. And really therapeutic, dude. Seriously. So I have 1 minute left, and you'll notice that as you get towards that 7 minute mark, your dough starts to get much more firm. It becomes a little bit harder to knead. It's not accepting as much of the flour, and you don't have to force all of this flour in. The dough will take what it needs. And if it's not getting sticky as you're kneading, you can see I just keep kneading and kneading and I'm not getting so sticky now. That's okay, you don't have to add more flour, but you want to add more flour if it's sticky so that you can knead it properly. So only add the flour as you need it when you need it. But when it stops taking flour, you can stop adding flour, because I still have flour in my sifter, but I don't really need it. Alright, so So my 7 minutes is done. I've been kneading for 7 minutes now, and you can't see it, but behind me on the stove is a medium-sized pot that I filled with water and I put on to boil right when I started kneading, so that my water was boiling, or it was coming up to a boil while I was kneading my bread. Alright, now what I'm going to do is take my kneaded dough and put it back into the bowl that I mixed it in, I just throw a little bit of flour down into the bottom of the bowl just so the dough doesn't stick. But that way I'm not dirtying up another whole bowl. So I just take my kneaded dough, plop it down into my mixing bowl, get all the little bits of flour off, and I cover it with a kitchen towel. Now there are a couple of ways you can go about letting your bread rise. The way I do it is I have the pot of boiling water on the stove. I set my bowl, my mixing bowl with the bread in it, inside the cold oven with the pot of boiling water beside it. You know, obviously it's not boiling anymore, but the pot of hot water, because the heat and moisture from the water helps to make your bread dough rise, and it keeps it nice and moist. You can also turn your oven on for just 3 or 4 minutes to get it a little bit warm, and then turn it back off and set your bread dough in the oven that's just a little bit warm to rise, or you can just let it rise on the counter. The colder the spot, so for example if I let it rise here on the counter, that's significantly colder than inside my closed up oven with a pot of hot water. So the colder the spot, the longer it's going to take to rise. But basically you want to let your dough double in size. So we can see my dough right now is way down here in the bottom, and I want that to be double in size before I go on to the next step. It's usually about 30 minutes. You want to check it in about 30 minutes and see what it looks like, and judge from there. If it's not double in size, just either reboil your water and stick it back in there and give it another 30 minutes, or just let it set and do its thing. Don't mess with it. Don't try to fix it in any way. Just give it another 30 minutes and see what it does. Okay, it's been 30 minutes, so I want to check my check my dough and see if it's already risen and if it's doubled in size. So I'm just going to pull it out, give it a little peek, and yeah, I think it's good. I think it's pretty much doubled in size. So I'm going to pull this out. And now we want to move on to the next spot. So while my bread was rising, I went ahead and greased 2 bread pans. And I have 3 different bread pans. But I wanted to just quickly show you what I do. So I just take a tiny bit of olive oil and a paper towel and just rub it all around the pan. So I come into the creases, up on the sides, and just make sure the entire pan is coated in a nice thin layer of olive oil. And don't forget to do the bottom. Give it a good once around to make sure that the oil completely coats it, and then set this off to the side. Alright, now comes the really fun part. So what you want to do is take some olive oil and drizzle it right onto the counter. And you want to kind of rub it around and spread it out everywhere that you're going to be working. And you want it to be fairly long because you're going to be rolling out your dough and it gets really long. So you want your olive oil to coat a nice long spot on your counter. Now you want to take your bread dough out of your bowl. And you want to break it into 3 equal-ish size chunks. So, 3 balls that are kind of equal in size. Okay? You're going to work with 1 ball at a time. You want to make sure your counter is nice and oiled where you've been laying that dough down, so just spread your oil out again. Kind of roll it into a little tube-ish thing. And now you want to take your rolling pin, and mine's a 2-piece thing. Oops, too much. And you want to take some of that olive oil and coat your rolling pin. This is also a good time if you have a wooden rolling pin to go ahead and grease your pin as well. Now, You just want to roll out your dough. And like I said, it's going to get long. That's okay. That's what you want. And you're going to hear these little air bubbles popping. I don't know if you can hear it, but mine are popping. And actually, I'm going to try and show you. But you can see there's an air bubble right here, and you want to roll it out until the air bubbles pop. Like that. But you'll use your rolling pin to do that. So you're just rolling it out. Until all those air bubbles pop. Once you've popped out the air bubbles, you're just going to roll up your dough. And then plop it down in your bread pan. I try to keep mine centered just because I want pretty bread. It doesn't have to be if it's got like a little curve in it or whatever. It doesn't really matter. I try to keep mine centered just because I'm crazy that way, so that's what I do. And then you make sure your counter is still nice and oily, which I added quite a bit that first time, so I don't generally have to oil again. Roll it out. And then roll it into a tube. Plop it down into your pan. Spread the oil around. Roll it out. Did you hear that? Did you hear the air bubble pop? That was a good loud one. I don't know if you've been able to hear the rest of them, but that was a loud one. If your dough tears, it's no big deal. Just stick it back together and put that on the inside. When you roll it back up, make sure that's where you start. Roll it up. And plop it in the pan. Actually, for me, this loaf seems smaller than this loaf, and since my orange pan is smaller than my silver pan, I'm just going to switch these. I'm going to lay this one in here and this one in here. I want that on the bottom. There we go. Now what you want to do is take all three of your pans, or however many loaves yours ended up making. Mine always makes 3, always. And you're going to stick them back in the oven with that pot of boiling water. So I've had my water on the stove again, bringing it back up to a boil this whole time. And now I'm just going to stick my pot of boiling water and my 3 loaves of bread back into the oven. I'm going to cover them again with a kitchen towel and let it rise again. But this time what you're looking for is you want this dough to completely fill the pan. So it should be up to the top or even coming up over the pan, and you want your pan to be completely full with the dough. So it's going to rise again and expand. And I usually start it at 30 minutes and check it, but the same as the last theory, it's more important that the dough rises enough to fill the pan than to go by a certain amount of minutes. So I start with 30 minutes, I check it, see if it's filling the pan. If it is, I go ahead and bake. If it's not, I give it another 30 minutes, come back and check it again. So these are going back into the oven with the pot of water and covered with the tea towel. Alright, it's been another 30 minutes, so I want to check on my bread and see if it's filling the pan yet. You can see I have my pot in here of water. And it's kind of filling the pan, but not completely. So I want my bread to fill the pan a bit more than this, so what I'm going to do is take my water out, bring it back up to a boil, and then put it back in here in the oven for another 30 minutes and just let the bread do what it wants to do. Better to let it rise and get to filling the pan than to just start baking it now and have it not turn out right. Alright, it's been another 30 minutes, so I want to check my bread and see if it's doubled or filling the pan, and it is! See, sometimes it's just a matter of giving it time to do what the fuck it wants to do and needs to do. So I'm going to pull my water pot out of the oven. You know, you just need to let the bread do its thing. Don't try to fucking rush it and don't try to go by a time schedule. Just let it do its fucking thing. So now what I'm going to do is, and you don't want to be moving this around too much because you don't want it to fall. So what I'm going to do is turn my oven to 350 and let this bake for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, I'm going to come check it and see if it is done. And I will come back on and talk face to face with you about how to determine whether or not your bread is done and ready to come out of the oven. Alright, my bread's been baking for 30 minutes, so I want to carefully open the oven and take a peek, and I can see that it's starting to brown beautifully. But the most important thing is to give it the sound test. So I'm going to gently pick up a loaf and tap it with a spoon, and it sounds hollow. You don't want it to sound dense, you want it to sound hollow. I think it's good. This one's definitely done. I'm going to pull it out. But I'm going to give these two just a couple more minutes, maybe 2 more minutes, and come back to them. Alright, it's been another 2 minutes, so I'm going to open the oven, pull out my loaves. They look better, they look more brown, but the most important thing is the sound test. They sound hollow. Once you hear the hollow sound, you know they're done. The hollow sound is far more important than any number of minutes. Can you hear that? It sounds very hollow and very light. There you go! How fucking spectacular is that? Oh my god! Oh my god, it smells so good. This is the best fucking bread ever. Like, ever in the history of ever. Best bread ever. Alright, so I baked it for 30 minutes, and then 1 loaf was done, the other 2 weren't quite done, so I put them in, and I check it every couple of minutes. I don't sit it back in there for another 5 or 10 minutes. I usually do 2 minutes at a time, because once it gets to a certain point, it's going to cook very quickly and it's going to brown very quickly. So if you feel like it's not done on the inside, but the top is getting too done, you can tint it with foil so that way it doesn't brown so much. But be careful because the bottom side could still get a little too done. You can always slip a cookie sheet up underneath the loaf pans, tint it with foil, those kinds of things, but you want to make sure that the inside is done. So, alright, so once your bread is done, you want to pull it out of the oven and let it cool. Now, I like to eat it fresh out of the oven. You have to be careful when you cut it because it'll kind of deflate a little bit, but if you're really careful, you can slice off some slices while it's super hot and steamy and perfect and slather some butter on there. Oh my god, it's so good. Anyway, but you can also let it cool completely before you cut it, which makes it a little bit more firm and a little bit easier to cut, but that's just total preference. Use a serrated, like a real bread knife, because this bread is so soft and light and fluffy. As you're cutting it, if you're putting a lot of pressure onto it or really like slicing into it, you're going to condense it down and you're going to take away that fluffy goodness, and you don't want to do that. So make sure you're using a serrated knife, and it doesn't take a whole lot of pressure, so don't squeeze the bread and don't really press down with the knife. Let the blade do its job and just kind of follow it down. So when you're taking it out of the pan, depending on your pan, now like I have 2 here. This one is one of those silicone pans, and so really nothing sticks to it, and your bread will just, oh my god. That's the bottom. See, this pan gets a little bit more brown than the other ones. So that's the first loaf, and you can see it's good size. This is my smallest loaf, but it's still good size for sandwich bread. Actually, this is the size loaf that I get from the Italian bread. When I buy regular sandwich sliced bread here in Italy, this is how big my loaf is. So slightly smaller than a traditional loaf. And then I also have this one. Sorry, you see I have cupcakes up here? I've been baking all day. Today's Ostara, so I've been baking all day. And then I have this one, which is also a non-stick pan. And look at the bottom of that one. Oh my God, it's perfect. This is the perfect loaf right here. Look at it's perfectly golden brown. Oh my, I want to like snuggle with this. But if you're using a pan that's not non-stick, you will have oiled it, but it can still kind of stick just a little bit, so it probably won't just flop right out of the pan. So you want to take a butter knife and push it in and pull towards you. You don't want to like slide through because you can tear your bread. You don't want to have to do any of that. So you just want to stick the knife in and pull away from the side. Pull it out, stick it in, just gently pulling away. This is hard to do when I'm not looking at it. Just gently pull it away from the side. You can probably hear the notification on my phone going off. So you want to do that all the way around. Make sure you get the corner and just gently pull it away from the side, and you'll see it kind of like letting go. It's like that elasticy, gentle tearing away from the side, but it doesn't fuck up your bread. So that's the bottom. You can see it. This is the one that I had to pull away from the side, and that's why, because it does stick a little bit if you're using a non-stick, or if you're not using a non-stick pan. So that's the bottom, and look at how big and thick. Ooh, how thick. Oh my God. I could like sleep on this. It's so pretty. Oh God, it smells so good. It tastes so good. So yeah, there you have it. That is my bread recipe. It is absolutely perfect. So you'll find the link to Delia's original blog post that I found this recipe on. Plus you'll find my little notes about how I tweak the recipe using only the bread flour, using the pot of boiling water, using only 7 cups of flour. Those little tweaks that I've made will be in the description here below. So if you like this kind of stuff, remember you can find me all over the place. I am on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram. I have the Facebook group, the Mixed Mediology Clubhouse, where we talk about all kinds of cool stuff, art, the Year in the Life Journal free class that I offered, just random shit, cuss words, Halloween projects. We talk about all kinds of cool stuff. And I also have a brand new Facebook group that you may or may not have heard about, and I'm going to do a separate video and talk about that here in a little while, but it's called Amaranth and Oracle. And basically I'm doing a Year in the Life tarot study, and so I asked if there were any other people that were interested in this. It's not a class where I teach anything. It's not like I'm guiding you through how to do this. It's a go at your own pace, do your own thing, use your own deck, work in a style that is coherent with your personal representations and your intuition. So it's about all that, but we're just sharing what we're doing in the same group together. So if you're interested in learning more about tarot, or if you're already familiar with tarot, if you just want to reconnect or take a deeper dive into tarot, then come join the Amaranth and Oracle group that I have on Facebook. And the link for all those things, for my Facebook page and Instagram and Pinterest and the Mixed Mediology Clubhouse and Amaranth and Oracle. Seriously, dude, like I'm all over the fucking internet, and you can find the links to all those places in the description below. If you like what I do here, don't forget to hit that little subscribe button. That way you don't miss anything. Then you can share it with your friends. That way they can hang out with us too. I hope you have a great day. Today's Ostara, so we're getting ready to have our Ostara feast, which is a pork roast and some potato salad and deviled eggs and corn on the cob and homemade bread, and then cupcakes for dessert. Little springtime cupcakes. What are they called? What are these called? Oh, I can't find them. Oh, this. Funfetti. I'm making funfetti, which I don't usually do stuff with from a box, but it has sprinkles. So cute. So, funfetti cupcakes for dessert. Anyway, I digress. So, if you like what I do here, don't forget to hit that little subscribe button, then share it with all your friends. That way they can hang out with us too. Thank you all so much for being here. Be sure to let me know if you try this bread recipe, if you like it, and if you think it's the best fucking bread in the whole world. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'll see you next time. Mwah. Bye!